Welcome to the Endure Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Kosovic. Today I'm joined by Adam Buchanan, host of the First Generation Bowhunter podcast. I had an awesome time talking to Adam on this episode. I think you're really going to enjoy it. We talk about how to deal with adversity in bow hunting, the journey, growth, and struggle that you go through when you start out in archery and you work your way up. It was such an awesome time talking to Adam. He's a great person in the outdoor industry, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Kosovic. If you're listening and you're not on the Endure Hunt podcast, I am a guest with Adam Buchanan over at the First Gen Bowhunter podcast. And if you're listening on the Endure Hunt podcast, I am joined today by Adam. We've been following each other for a little bit on Instagram, and finally, after commenting and talking on different posts, finally getting together to talk. I'm really excited to talk bow hunting, first gen bow hunting with you, and yeah, it's great to be able to connect to you. It's awesome what social media can do.
Yeah, we're a bit of a unique breed. I feel like when I say first generation bow hunter, people are like quietly raising their hand in the back, and they're like, "Yeah, that's me." So it's cool to meet others.
Yeah, it's funny. I got my start in bow hunting because I didn't really have a choice. When I lived in New Jersey, is how I got started. I either was going to do shotgun for deer, muzzle loader, or archery. And when I got back from Montana, my first hunt, I was like, well, I don't know anything about muzzle loaders. The idea of using slugs or a double aught buck to shoot a deer didn't sound super exciting.
Yeah.
So it just made so much sense to do bow hunting. And let me tell you, I have rode the struggle bus the entire way because I lived an hour and a half from the nearest bow shop. So my choice was basically, we're going to go to Dick's Sporting Goods. I think that's where I bought my first bow. Luckily, there was a guy who knew half of something about bows and kind of got us set up. And I've mostly done everything myself since then. And I remember hearing one of your podcasts. It might have been with Carrie, actually, Dark Archer, for those who are familiar, where you were both talking about how you were like terrified to change your own strings and stuff. I had no choice. I remember doing that like my third season. I was like, I'm either going to do this or I'm not hunting.
It's scary pulling back on that first D loop that you tie. Oh, it's like that was more nauseating than like, you know, pulling back on my first deer. Is like I'll do that all day long, but no, I'll take someone else's D loop any day.
Yeah. Man, it's just funny when you think about, because for me it was a question of I'm either going to hunt or I'm not,
Yeah.
because with the job I had at the time, I couldn't get out to a bow shop if I wanted to. And you got to do what you got to do. But I wanted to ask you, so did you grow up hunting and find bow hunting as an adult? What is that? What was your journey like getting into bow hunting?
Yeah, so I did not grow up bow hunting or hunting at all. And what's ironic is my dad was a massive hunter. He was huge into it. He started when he was a very young age. And youngest of six, I think I just may have like got lost in the shuffle. And the first time he took me hunting, I was about 25, 26 years old. And it was this, elk hunt, kind of drive around the truck, follow these high school kids running around their private property for some tag he had bought. And I just remember thinking like, this is so boring. This is so dumb. Like there's nothing out here. We're not doing anything. And then like the last day at like 10 minutes until darkness, I got to take some shots and totally missed. And I was just remember thinking like, there's 2-3 feet of snow out. I just want to go home. I'm tired. I'm cold. Like this sucked. And that was like my first intro to hunting, really. And so how I came to bow hunting was, that was probably 5 or 6 years later. I took a job at Cabela's and as their social media director. And so I was living in Denver at their little corporate office. And, I was like, man, if I'm going to go work at Cabela's, I gotta start, getting more accustomed to weapons. Right. And so, bow just felt right. There was a lot of Disney movies out at that time. I think Brave had just come out, Hunger Games, lot of influence from media around archery. And I was influenced. That's what I was drawn to. I'll be the first to admit it. And so I joined Cabela's, and I remember the first day they took me in, they were like showing me around the tour up in Sydney, and they're like, "Did you bring your bow?" I mean, that was one of the first questions they asked. I mean, it wasn't like, "Hey, you should probably buy a bow if you're going to work here." It was like, "Did you bring your bow?" It was just assumed. And I was like, "Yeah, I've got it right here." And so we went and shot, and I was shooting super well, like, because I had practiced. And I just remember thinking, like, this is going to be fun. Like, this is going to be really cool. So that's how I kind of got into archery. And then I was, man, I struggled for so many years. It took me years to get a shot at an animal.
That's awesome. I mean, the journey, it's not awesome that it took you years, but
Yeah.
the dedication that you've put in. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your podcast, and you're honest about it, you say it, like you discuss the things that are not, you don't fluff it up. You tell the truth. You are transparent about, the struggle that you go through. And you've had a lot of struggle this year, I know personally as well. And you had a difficult hunting season, but I know you just had success. You got an awesome buck,
Yeah.
and you were able to hunt with your son, who's a killer tracker. So you have been having a pretty good season. It seems like things are working out for you so far.
Yeah. It was kind of a slow start. I probably went out 10 or 12 times. And the thing that's been funny about this year is every season I still feel like that new hunter, even though I've killed close to 10 animals, I guess, over the years. And I just get out there and I'm just kind of like, man, I really don't know what I'm doing. But, I just try to like build off of last year. But I just, I try to give myself maybe a little bit more credit in those instances too of like, hey, I can take shots, and so this year was, I think my theme, if I was to look back, is don't leave anything out there, like leave it all out there. And so I took a lot of shots. I really did. And I was just like, I'm pulling back. I'm releasing arrows. I'm going to shoot a doe. I'm going to shoot a buck. I'm not going to like that buck fever thing just doesn't, it's not hitting me. And I've been doing this a while, and
Mhm.
I'm really not concerned about size. So I don't know what's wrong with me.
I have that problem too. I don't know that it's really a problem. I don't get that anxious anymore. I used to. The first couple of animals that I've done most of my hunting with a rifle. I've only killed two with a bow. But even with a rifle, I would get that buck fever before. Like I would shake uncontrollably,
Mm,
even if it was on a doe. Like it didn't have to be buck fever. It was
sure.
just animal fever. But now I I feel like I can stay calm, but as soon as it happens, that moment when I take the shot and I know the animal is down, my adrenaline just dumps and then everything goes crazy. Like last year when I got my first elk, I literally like my hands went numb. It was so impactful. But I feel the same way when I'm in that moment, and I don't know, maybe it's repetitions.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think it is? What do you think that helps you maintain calm?
Yeah. For me, it was like when you enter into that instance, it's like going somewhere else. Like you're blinking everything out. And one of the things that has helped me is really like putting my phone away. I'll find myself going out there, and Western hunting is, you're on your feet, you're walking, you're moving around. I know with like whitetail and tree stands, like you're kind of hunkered down for a good 8 to 12 hours, or as long as you can handle it. Um, but I'll find myself kind of getting distracted, like, oh, I'm gonna check email. Like I, I'm pretty connected. I do digital marketing for a job, and so the littlest email can pop through, and all of a sudden my mindset is completely changed, and I'm not hunting. I'm back home. I'm back at work. And so I've really tried to use do not disturb. I've really tried to like, hey, if I'm going to use my phone, it's going to be for Onyx, but that's helped me. What's helped you?
I really don't know. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. Maybe it's just repetitions. I think for
Yeah.
me, I'm it might be fear. It might be fear too, because I don't want to make a bad shot. And I did make a bad shot. It wasn't an awful shot,
Yeah.
but I made every time I go out there, I want to take a perfect shot. You said something where you want I don't remember which episode it was, but when you are releasing that arrow, you want it to kill. Like the goal is to kill.
Yeah.
And I go in with that mindset, and I always want it to be that perfect kill shot. And I think my hyper focus maybe is part of what it is, because I don't want to wound something. I'm also colorblind. So tracking is not something that I can really
Oh,
do that well because if it's gone, I am kind of SOL. I can see pools of blood,
yeah.
but if it's not a perfect shot, I'm in trouble. I'm not in a good place.
So like selecting a broadhead for you must be a really important choice.
Oh man. Yes, it is. I want to talk broadheads. I want to talk about a lot of archery stuff. So, I started with mechanicals. I had a Rage, and I don't have it for those who are on video. I don't have it in here, but my first year I shot was with a Rage. I don't remember which one, and it hit the shoulder and a rib, and it got all sorts of twisted up. Fortunately, it still was a pass through somehow, but from that one on, I've only used fixed blades, and I really like the idea of being able to know that I'm going to get a pass through, and I always want to. Even the bad shot. So the bad shot I took this year, which was on for those watching this buck. This I shot with Carrie
Oh
actually.
wow.
Um, the he ducked hard. I actually got two shots at this deer
Jeez.
in the early morning at 22 yards. He ducked. I couldn't believe it. It's making me want to upgrade my bow. We'll talk about that. Um, so I take the shot and he ducks it like a ninja. And then the second one, I thought he was looking away, but I watched the footage back and he was staring at me and he ducked again. So I got the one long on the entrance, but I hit his spine and spined him. And the broadhead, it's oh, how am I forgetting it? It's it looks like the Iron Will, but it's not Iron Will. It's
Oh,
it's a
tooth.
Day
Oh,
six
day
Evo
six.
X. Day six Evo X, 150 grains. Those things are sharp. So it went through the spine, clean through the spine, severed the whole thing, went through the other side, and was still sharp enough to cut paper when I got home. I mean, those things
Wow.
are sharp. I just wish the shot was better. Um, um, yeah, that's me. That's what I've been shooting. But I honestly I'm thinking about changing my entire setup because of him jumping the string at 22 yards.
Yeah.
But I'm very curious. What's your go-to broadheads? And I want to like, what's your journey been from your first bow to where you are now, and what have been like the most impactful things you've changed? Because I've changed a lot, but I still have the same bow that I had in 2019. And I'm starting to think, maybe I've progressed enough that I should consider upgrading to a flagship type bow.
Yeah. That's a really important question and probably one of the most popular topics that people seek out my show for. Um, yeah, so my first bow was like $140 at a pawn shop. I was below the Dick's Sporting Goods level. I just Yeah, walked in. I think I made that purchase in less than 8 minutes. I was just like, "Yeah, I want a bow. Oh, there's a bow. Great." So that was the bare lights out and it looked cool. It looked vicious. It, had the big cams and I didn't know those are even called cams. I just went in, I said I'd like a compound bow. He's like, "I've got these 3." And I'm like, "Yeah, that one's in my price range." So then I went to Dick's and got it set up and they were kind of helping me get situated. I learned about a release. I literally, I mean, it was like I was the most naive consumer you could pluck off the earth. And so I sent a few downrange, kind of got my feel, bought some arrows, bought a target, like literally just, you know, starting from scratch. And what's funny is YouTube was out back then. I mean, this was 2010, 2011. So YouTube was there. It wasn't not there. But for some reason, and I don't know why, and I probably need to talk about this more because people probably wonder, like, Adam, like, why didn't you watch more YouTube? I didn't think to. I didn't think that, like, someone online is going to teach me how to use such a powerful weapon. And so at that time, YouTube was just funny cat videos, right? Like in my mindset. And so I just kind of like white knuckled through the experience. And so that was just shooting arrows down range. I didn't, I never took that bow hunting. Thankfully, I think there were so many things wrong with it. I probably was just totally unaware. Had a whisker biscuit, didn't do a drop away. Um, then I start working for Cabela's and we're selling these cool bows and doing collaborations with Bowtech and I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And I'm part of the marketing campaign. So I'm really like in these bows. And so I bought a Cabela's Instigator because it's all about the name. And this was the bow that we did a huge launch with. And I just was like, man, I love this bow. It looks cool. And still didn't have a drop away. I had a whisker biscuit. And so fast forward quite a ways. I was still hunting with a rifle and kind of transitioning to like, okay, I'm going to start shooting animals with a bow. So my first broadhead was the Rage Hypodermic. Um, and it was like the bare bones, simple Rage Hypodermic. I mean, we're talking first gen. And so there wasn't anything fancy on it. It had the collars. That's what I don't love about mechanicals sometimes is just they get mangled even just walking. And so there's just a little high maintenance. So I kill a deer with my Instigator, Bowtech Cabela's bow, and a Rage Hypodermic at 57 yards. And the adrenaline I felt like lasted for days. Like I couldn't come off that high. It was so intense. And so uh, just days later, I sold my really nice rifle that I'd taken quite a bit of time like working on, and I was reloading, and yeah, I was doing the whole rifle thing. And
You were
man,
all in.
it
Yeah.
was just like, I'm done. Sell the bow, getting a better bow. Like I just didn't even hesitate. So I got an Elite Impulse 31 and still had a whisker biscuit. And I remember I go bought it off camofire.com, which is, ironically is where I work now. And my buddy Kendall Card, who started Camofire, I go pick it up and he's at the office. I'm like, hey man, he's so funny. He's like, oh, you got a big kid bow. And I'm like, yeah, because the last two bows literally were youth bows and no one like had told me. And oh, it's so funny now as I look back. But so I get this big kid bow, and he's like, "We got to get you out of a whisker biscuit. Like, let's get you in a drop away." And I'm like, "What's a drop away?" and so, and then like I didn't have a stabilizer, and so he's like, "Probably should throw a stabilizer." I'm like, "What's a stabilizer?" Oh man, I mean, still, like my journey of being really naive lasted for years in those early stages, and so I had the Elite and it was awesome because I could shoot it at 100 yards, and they were just sending arrows down. And that was the other thing was arrows. I was shooting Walmart arrows. I killed that first deer with a $4.69 Walmart arrow, like a mossy oak, and it killed it. It it killed the deer at 57 yards, you know. And so that was the other thing. Kendall was like, step into my office, right? And he's like, dude, let me introduce you to Gold Tip. It's a great company. It's a great arrow brand. So I shot Kinetic Chaos, the blue ones, and never looked back. I still shoot that arrow, and they're awesome. And so that's really helped me kind of opened up to those longer distances and have some fun that way for practice. Then that bow got stolen and I called
Oh,
Kendall. Yeah, that was hard. That boat got stolen out of the back of my truck like 4 weeks before an elk hunt. And this is heartbreaking. It was a limited entry lifetime elk hunt in Utah. So you technically can only draw this like once every 6 years if you're lucky. And a lot of guys don't draw it for 10 or 20. And me, Mr. Naive, drew this limited entry bull elk tag. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, I'm going elk hunting. So insane looking back. But that bow got stolen. Call Kendall. I'm like, bro, I can't even like talk about it. I'm so upset. He got me in with Hoyt with a contact over there. And they're like, hey, we have a demo bow. It's been at like 75 trade shows, you could borrow it for the season. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you. So I start shooting this really nice Hoyt, and I still shoot that bow. I bought it from them. I said, hey, I'd like to buy this bow, and it's the Hoyt RX1 Carbon. It's like the first edition Redworks. And I've shot other bows. I've shot plenty of others, and that was I go back to that one. Like if I could carbon copy that bow, I always look for them used because I'm like, I just want another Redworks, an RX1. Like that's all I want.
what do you love about that bow so much?
My favorite thing is when you pull back, the back wall is really smooth. And so after shooting it for like 6 months, I was like, I love this bow. This is so cool. So RX3 was out and a turbo. And I was like, turbo, that sounds fun. Like literally, like this is my mind. Like this is my mindset. I'm not thinking like anything else. I'm like still stuck on the marketing of names of these bows. So I go buy a turbo and I had the RX1 still. And I didn't love the turbo when you pull back in that back wall, it goes clunk, like it sinks back on that last inch. And I hated that. And I asked somebody about it, and they're like, well, that's a turbo bow. That's kind of how they function. They have a really violent back wall. I was like, I'm done. I hate that feeling. And I'm sure it works for some people. But so I sold that bow and just stuck with my RX1 just because it's smooth. It's consistent. I know what it's going to do. It's very predictable. That's why I like that bow.
That makes sense. I am a little nervous for when I eventually do decide to get my next bow because I'm going to do it the right way. I live in Austin. Well, I don't live in Austin. I live near Austin. We have archery country. We have quite a few bow shops in the area.
Mm,
I'm going to go in and I'm going to use different bows and I'm finally going to see what I like and don't like. I have only ever shot the bow I have now. It's a Diamond Edge SB1. It was like $300 with a whisker biscuit,
yeah.
some generic 4-pin sight, and the smallest pathetic stabilizer you can imagine. But it got me hunting, and I killed my first deer with it. And I couldn't tell you anything about the arrows that I used because the guy at Dick's was just like, "These are the appropriate spine for you. Here you go."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Okay, here we are." um, but I've only ever shot that bow. So the amount of YouTube videos I've watched and things I've read about the differences between bows, it's all gibberish to me because I haven't actually used any of them. Because when you actually look at the specs, like I don't know how often you look at spec sheets, but if you look at the spec sheets for a Diamond Edge SB1 versus some of the flagship bows, you're like, there's a 10% difference. Is it really worth 10%? But everyone says it is. And I know I'm going to experience it when I get there, but I'm not there yet. Mostly because spending $1,400 on a new bow is a lot of money.
I hear you. Yeah. I was that same way. It's like what we know is what we know, and that was my journey. I spent 2 to 4 years with every single one of my bows, and it was from you know gar pretty low level youth bow all the way up to a flagship. And I liked that journey though too because I felt like it wasn't rushed or it wasn't. It was like, well, it sucked getting my bow stolen. That wasn't cool. But it didn't feel like I was just sucked into all like, oh, the new bow, the new bow, the new bow. Like a lot of guys, they sell theirs every year and they buy the new one. And I guess when you get to that point, maybe that's just part of it. And I think other hobbies people do that too. But yeah, I'd say enjoy that journey and just find what works for you. It sounds like you're going about it the right way.
Thanks. I hope so. I am not one of those gear guys that buys the newest thing every single year.
Yeah.
I like to make the mileage out of my stuff and really I feel like if you don't use it enough, you don't really understand it that well. And I'm a firm believer, and this is partly because I didn't grow up with a lot of money and my very first hunting experiences were making use of what I had.
Mm,
I know that you can get things done with less than ideal gear. And I don't want gear to be the thing that keeps me out of the woods.
yeah.
And I'm sure you feel that way too. Is like focus on what you actually need, practice with it, get really good. And then once you have some success under your belt and confidence and know where you need to improve, you can make an educated decision. At least that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, my wife talks about it with like tennis rackets and how she was handed like a very old tennis racket and she had to play with that for like a year. And then it was like, okay, you've gone to practice, you've done what you're supposed to, you've put in the time. Here's an upgraded racket. And it was like, oh, and you just appreciate it so much more. So I'm excited for you because you're going to get that new bow and just be like, oh my gosh, they can do this. Like, I didn't know I was missing out. But not that what you have is bad. It's just there's a whole other world out there. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, when I do upgrade, I will message you and let you know my reaction
I want
because
to hear about it.
I want to do the whole thing. I want to do the whole thing. I want to try all of the different bows and see which brand feels good. And the thing is, every single person you ask has their favorite bow company.
Hmm.
Like I see people who are obsessed with Matthews and Hoyt and PSE and Prime, and every brand seems to have these great things going for them. And I've accepted that you just have to shoot a bunch of them and see which one feels good and go off of the feel. And I think that's what I'm going to do once I convince myself and tell my wife that I'm going to spend money on a new bow.
Yeah.
I'll do it eventually.
Well, for me, I might have a bigger connection with Hoyt because their generosity of letting me borrow a bow in such a time of desperation. I'm like, them as a company also kind of showed their colors of like, oh, wow, like that's how you guys operate. That was very impactful for me in a time of desperation. So I'm probably a Hoyt guy for life, but if I bought a Matthews backup, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Yeah. Brand is something, and obviously this is your wheelhouse. You do marketing, branding. Brand is such an interesting thing because if I have a good customer experience with a brand, I'm pretty much staying with them.
Yeah.
I've I've worked with different industries. I've worked in a lot of different roles, and as a consumer, you have no choice but to deal with things. And if I find a company that treats me right, I'm all about it.
Yeah.
Like I'm cool. I will stick with you forever because I know that if I call you, you're going to help me and you're not going to blow me off, and it's going to be someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Which I love Black Ovis. I know you started working for Black Ovis
Yeah.
this year. I don't actually use Camel Fire that much. I check them all of the time, but I very rarely pull the trigger on anything. But man, I love Black Ovis. Y'all have those I don't remember. I think they're 800 fill down pants. I brought those on my hunting trip to Montana this
Mm.
year, and those things saved my butt glassing. They are perfect. I love those
Literally
things.
saved your butt.
Literally, yes, literally saved my butt. How
Yes.
has working there changed you as a hunter? Has it impacted you? I know it's only been this year, so
Yeah.
maybe it hasn't changed you that much, but how, how has that exposure changed things for you?
Yeah, it's been a difference because we're definitely a specialty retail. We work with very, hand-picked, curated gear. We're very thoughtful about what we put on the website, what we ourselves use. I like to use the thought process of we're a company of, we build product by hunters for hunters, or we curate product by hunters for hunters. And so I think that's kind of the thought process there. For me, changing as a hunter, I think I've picked up so many different skills and thought processes just surrounded by people just within 10 feet of me in the office. And, this person's really thoughtful of how they fletch their arrows. And this person's really thoughtful of like tracking and how to find animals. And so I know I can walk over and talk to Colby and be like, dude, here's an area I'm looking at. And he can look at my Onyx in the office and just be like, do you notice how this is happening on the contour? And do you notice this is, and I'm like, holy smokes, like I would have never thought to read it that way. And so I feel like I'm becoming more of a hunter than I ever have, not just a guy with a really cool, expensive bow and it's going to go walk around the woods with it. I also feel like we have a mantra of social media is great and it's a cool way to do business and interact with people. Like we're very much about it. We just did this funny crispy video today and kind of having some fun with that. But like there is definitely a sense of it's not for the gram, and I really appreciate that, and I like their thoughtfulness. And we do work with people who like a Dan Staten with Elk Shape, who he doesn't do it for the gram per se, but he's very good at content creation and interacting with his community. And um, there's definitely like so much value in that. But us as a retailer, I like that we're transparent where we can be, but don't need to like perfectly curate every little moment and of the hunt. And some of that's just really private and really personal. And so there's some things that have happened this hunting season I haven't put on Instagram. I haven't talked about on my podcast. And I may never will because I just may hang on to that. And I think that's how I've evolved as a hunter this year.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting balance. I'm not, despite having this podcast, which I started this year, I am not a social media person. Anyone who follows my page, I post all of the time, but to be honest, I work in tech and most of that stuff is automated because I hate social media. I really do.
Yeah.
Like all of the comments, the messages, all of that's me, but I hate posting on social media. It feels dirty. And that's, I'm not putting anyone down
Yeah.
that makes their living off of social media. Like it's the nature of the game today. But for me, I'm more interested in doing something that is meaningful, putting out a message that's going to help somebody, and being able to connect with people. Because at the end of the day, it's supposed to help us make connections with others. Like you and I are talking right now because of social media. So positive things come from it. I met Carrie Beeson because of social media,
Yeah.
and that's great. But the people who post everything, it almost annoys me a little because some people try to make it look like their lives are perfect and that all they see is the big bucks falling and or the big bulls, whatever.
Yeah.
And that's great, but there's so much more to it. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, and this is I said this already, but that I appreciate that you do, is you're just transparent about the things that you think are going to resonate with others. Like the podcast you did where you said where I mean, I know that this is sort of the slogan, there's no free lunch,
Mm.
but that podcast that you did talking about that really resonated with me because that was how my dad was when I grew up. It's hard work. Nothing worth doing is easy. You've got to put in work no matter what it is. And if you put in the work, it'll pay off eventually, but you've got to do it and be willing to see it through to the end. And I feel like social media is sort of the antithesis of that, where it's just all glamour and the end. And as much as I would love to say hunting social media isn't that way, it totally is. We all glorify the trophy shots and the fancy angles and everything. Sorry, I tend to rant sometimes, so I know I
No.
just kind of went all over the place and went down a rabbit hole.
Well, it's interesting you bring kind of that optic up of how it is viewed. I was talking to Drew over at Sitka, and we had a long discussion about how social media can actually be fairly dangerous for hunting. Specifically this year, have you noticed a lot of social media clips or reels of people taking frontal shots? Have you noticed that?
At
Yeah.
least on TikTok, I have.
Yeah, TikTok, it's oh man, it's like gasoline over there. Um, I and he had kind of brought that up and he's like, "Man, it's really interesting how people are really glorifying the frontal shot this year." And there's so many and there's like, "I had a frontal shot at 7 yards." And it's just like it's so like projected right now and he's like, "Man, that's not a good thing. We have to be so careful with frontal shots." And these people who are maybe a first generation bow hunter could be looking at that and be like, "Oh, am I supposed to take a frontal shot? Like, should I turn my target the other way so I can learn how to take better frontal shots?" And it's terrible. It's a terrible practice.
Yeah, that's a good point. The example that's set is going to be something that other people emulate, whether you know it or not.
Yeah.
And I think frontal shots got glorified because I saw them last year a lot on YouTube
Mm.
for elk hunting because, elk tend to come in to your calling during archery season. So a frontal shot is common, but this year I've noticed people taking them on whitetails. I've noticed people taking them on mule deer. And I am personally not a huge fan of it because there's not as much room for error. You're really having to get the angle just right. You're going for that hard shot or you're cutting the trachea. And if you don't get it just right, it's going to be a bad day. And yeah, the example that's set is something that we all need to be aware of when we're releasing content and doing things like that.
Yeah, like one of my worst shots was a gut shot and I felt awful and that arrow came out and it was bright yellow just like you see on the internet of how they describe a gut shot and it stunk and I was frantic and I was freaking out, and that thing took off. I mean, it barely phased it. And once it set in of what had happened, I just thought, oh my gosh, like, you know, what a thing to deal with. And it was awful. And I just remember thinking, like, I would have not wanted that on social media, not because, like, oh, I had a bad day or I had a bad hunt, but just I don't want to show people that to think, like, oh, it's okay. Well, here's what you do. And it's like, no, you don't want a gut shot. Like, don't shoot them there. Shoot them in the vitals.
Yeah. I've gone back and forth talking or thinking about how I want to handle situations like that. I
Mm-hmm.
have, fortunately, at this point, I haven't done a gut shot, but I released a podcast last week, and I called it 5 Lessons from Mule Deer Hunting in Montana. And one of the lessons that I put in there is that in the heat of the moment, you're not necessarily as moral as you like to think you are.
Mm,
And the reason for that was going into the hunt, I changed my rifle setup and I got a suppressor this year, which I love. Um, I have hearing issues from when I was in the military, so I love the suppressor. But that's neither here nor there. Um, I told myself, because I could only shoot out to like 400 yards before the season started, I don't want to shoot past 500 because I know I know the rifle really well. I know the dope, the turret system. I'm confident that if I have good dope from 50 to 400, that I can shoot out to 5.
mm.
Well, after 6 days of hunting, I got my first stalk in on a mule deer buck at 450 yards. He bounded out past 500, and in the heat of the moment, I was like, dial, wait. And he was perfectly broadside. But even before I pulled the trigger, I was like, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't take this shot. And I did it anyway because I was so like wanting to take my first mule deer. I had never done it before, still don't have it. And I was just immediately I missed. It was a clean shot. I was off by 2 MOA on my dial, thank God. And I have been beating myself up ever since then because I like to think I'm a moral person, but when the adrenaline is running and you're excited and you're desperate because it's literally the last day of the hunt, sometimes you make stupid decisions. And when I was driving home, I'm like, I'm in this situation. Chances are someone else is going to be in this situation. How do I talk about that in a way that will hopefully help people not be as stupid as I was in that moment? So I talked about it on the podcast, but I haven't really shared, and I don't think I did share any social media posts about it.
Mhm.
In my mind, if someone's taking the time to listen to the podcast, especially that far in, I think it was my third lesson, they're actually paying attention and trying to learn. And I feel like I can be a little bit more vulnerable that way. And, maybe it's not something I shouldn't talk about at all because it's not a good shot. And who knows, maybe I'll change my position about how I want to handle those conversations in the future. But that's how I've done it so far. And I guess I wanted to ask you this earlier and I forgot. Your shot wasn't good on your mule deer this year, right? And you maintained a positive attitude about it, and you talked about it on the podcast. I guess how do you approach those situations? How do you think people can learn from them? And also, how did you keep your head straight? Because I still beat myself up about that shot, and I missed, and that was like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think takes, having done it a few times, and so having some success and shooting a deer in the heart, and it goes down in 50 yards, and it happens so quick. Once you've had a few of those, it's really you've kind of calloused up for when it doesn't go right, because in some ways I have this sense of optimism of like, well, I found blood. I know it was a fairly good hit, but we've got our work cut out for us. So I don't, blood tracking to me is fueled with optimism. I love blood tracking. I think it's one of the most interesting things ever. I don't know why. Like, it's just, you see it and it's just like, okay, where did they go? And it's just the highest level of problem solving um, in my sphere. And to be with my son and for him to really kick in and be like, hey, what about this? And what about that? And I mean, he's not checking his phone. He's not, hey, can I get some screen time? I mean, it's like, it's the purest form of like primitive raw feelings you can experience. And so I think when you're in that state, and this is why I try to tell people, is like when you've taken that first shot, you've drawn blood and you made a pass through or you made a hit. Um, just know that like you're in one of the most unique time periods that you'll ever spend. Maybe that entire year, maybe that, for a long time. And just try to enjoy the moment, but also problem solve and don't give up and don't quit. And this one drug out for quite a while, and I was a little bummed by that. I was kind of like, dang it, like. But one thing that gave us a little hope was the area we are in. I wasn't afraid to bump him because I was like, if I bump him, I know I can have really good vantage points, and he's not going to make it very far. And so we bumped him twice, and that gave me a lot of optimism. And as I watched him really close, I could see he was struggling, and I could see, something kind of coming out of his chest, hanging there. I was like, okay, this is good. And so seeing that, pursuing that, we waited a good 30 minutes, 30, 45 minutes. The blood was really good though at the gate. And so I was just like, oh, he's probably just like up over this hill. Um, but it wasn't as good of a shot as I thought. And so I think if you're finding blood, if you're finding consistent blood, that's a time to also celebrate and like have some optimism that like, oh my gosh, I did it. This is happening. But it is hard when that blood trickles out and it's like, where'd it go? It's dribbles, it's drops, it's specks, and you lose it and you don't recover an animal. I've battled with this for a long time and I've talked to a lot of different hunters, and my favorite response was from Michael Merrill, just the most positive guy you'll ever meet. And he's just like, Adam, but like, we got to keep hunting. And that is part of hunting. And that's unfortunate. And I think of our ancestors who probably didn't recover animals, who didn't recover the buffalo that freaking charged at them and they couldn't get a spear in and it pieced out, but it was injured, or the woolly mammoth that towered over these little people. And I just think they dealt with that just like we do. And so I think sometimes we're in a world where it's like, I've got the 10 hacks to be the best bow hunter, and I've got the 4 tips to do this, and it's sure guaranteed results. And whether it's within archery or whether it's how to beat a video game in 40 seconds, because that's what my kids are looking up, it's like we're in this society of hacks and sure results. And in bow hunting, it's just not. And it really grounds you really fast.
Yeah. The things I took away from what you were saying are cherish the moment that you're in and being present because you're lucky to have had the opportunity to take the shot, especially if it's blood and there's not guts or anything like
Mm,
that. You've made a shot. It's probably lethal, so be present. Focus on the fact that you're lucky to be in that position, and then remember that you have to keep moving forward. You just have to. It's either you keep going or you quit and you never do it again. Those are kind of the things I took from that, and I appreciate that.
yeah.
I know we're coming up on your stop. I think we have about 5 minutes left. I have two questions that I want to ask you to kind of finish us out. One, what do you think is the most significant or important upgrade that you've made on your bow, and why?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And I know it's hard. Like someone just asked me the other day, there was like, hey, I'm buying my first bow. What am I doing? And I, I'm just, my mind goes a few different directions. Um, but I think one of the biggest upgrades that I made that was most pivotal was a drop away rest. Um, it holds that arrow so nice. It keeps it balanced. It does the job that needs to happen. And so when I started shooting with the drop away, I was blown away by the consistency and all of it. So that's what I would say. I think I've answered that differently, depending on when people ask me. Maybe in other times it was getting big boy arrows and not buying them from Walmart,
Yeah.
or like a really nice site with micro adjustment. But no, I kind of always go back to the drop away. I think that's when I notice the biggest shift in performance.
I mean, if you never changed your answer, then you're probably not growing as a bow hunter and an archer yourself. So it's good that your answer changes from time to time. All right, last question I wanted to ask you is I want you to think about, 2012 Adam, who's just getting into bow hunting. What advice would you give him with the experiences, the knowledge that you have now?
Ooh, wow. That's a really good question. What would I tell young Adam, young bow hunter Adam? Um, I would say if I could spend 5 minutes with him, I would say, um, ooh, dang, wow, it's a thinker. Um, I would say it's gonna be one of the hardest things you'll ever do. It will give you the widest range of emotions, um, but it also give you the highest levels of elation and dopamine, and you should absolutely do it. And you're gonna have the most frustrating, freakish, dark night, lost in the woods moments trying to find a deer. There's gonna be times where you just go out for hours and hours and don't see anything. You're gonna feel like the biggest idiot loser ever. Um, but if you quit, you're never gonna see that great success on the other side. And in terms of equipment, I would say, yeah, buy that crappy pawn shop bow. You should do that. Do it. Um, go through it. Shoot the Whisker Biscuit for 6 years. Shoot the crappy Walmart arrows, because when you pay for $150 for a dozen of arrows, um, versus whatever it would be at Walmart, you're going to appreciate it and you're going to take great care of those things. And so I wouldn't give myself any different advice equipment wise. I would say go through that journey, buy those crappy bows and progress and start there. Because I wouldn't want to rob myself of that experience.
I love it. Love everything about it through and through. The no regrets, making yourself go through it still. Absolutely love all of it. Thank you, Adam, so much for spending the time with me on the podcast. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, best way is, I honestly tell people LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. A lot of my audience actually finds me on LinkedIn. It's just Adam Buchanan, Buchanan. Instagram, Adam_Buchanan, and then you can download my podcast, First Generation Bowhunter, on all the directories, Spotify, Apple, and yeah. How about yourself? How can we find you?
Yeah, so I don't post much personally. I do have a personal Instagram, but I don't post on there. So I'm the Endure Hunt podcast. I mean, my name's Andrew Lukosevic, but you could find me on all of the socials. Really, Instagram is the only one that I actually pay attention to. It's Endure Hunt, ENDURHUNT, and the Endure Hunt podcast. You can find that on all of the major platforms as well. Would love to get a message from your listeners and connect to some fellow first gen hunters.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I would love to connect with you again and talk more about bow hunting because I feel like we only scratched the surface. So I'd love to connect one more time and talk bow hunting a little bit more.
Absolutely. Happy to.
All right, that does it for this episode. Thank you so much, Adam, for collaborating with me on this podcast. I had an awesome time and really appreciate everything that you do. And I want to say thank you to everyone who is watching and or listening to this podcast episode. I really appreciate you. Time is our most valuable asset, and I don't take it for granted that you chose to spend it with me. Thank you so much. I hope you got something out of this, and I'll see y'all next time.